My father always loved my brother more. When he chose a camping trip with him over my wedding, I asked my stepdad to walk me down the aisle, and my biological father was left broken. I'm 28 years old. I work as a project manager at a consulting firm. And I need to get this story off my chest. Because what happened a few months ago at my wedding basically made all the things I'd been holding in about my family for years explode. You know, all those things you pretend don't bother you but deep down are eating away at you. I guess I should start from the beginning, when my parents got divorced and everything changed. But the truth is, the real story starts way before that. When I was a kid and started realizing that my brother Gabriel was, let's say, my father Vincent's favorite in a way that wasn't even subtle. I grew up in a house where my brother could do anything, and it was like he'd discovered the cure for cancer. You know what I mean? He'd get a B in math, and my father would practically throw a party. I'd get straight A's, and I'd get a well done without my father even looking up from the newspaper. Gabriel would make the school soccer team, and my father would go to all his games wearing a shirt that said, "Proud Dad." I'd win speech and debate competitions, and my father just wouldn't show up because he had to take Gabriel to some training or whatever. And the worst part is that for years I thought it was normal. I mean, I literally grew up thinking that's just how things were, and that maybe I wasn't as interesting or talented as my brother, that maybe he deserved more attention. My mother, Patricia, noticed this, I think, but she had her own problems. Turns out she had an affair when I was like 12 years old. I found out years later when they were already divorced, and that was the end of the marriage. The divorce was horrible, like one of those divorces where the parents don't talk except to argue, and Gabriel and I were stuck in the middle of it all. But here's the thing. Even after the divorce, my father was still the same with us. Gabriel was still the sun that everything revolved around, and I was like the moon. You know, there, but nobody really looks at it. My mother remarried Lawrence like 2 years after the divorce, and Lawrence, I'm not gonna lie, was the best thing that could have happened to us because he actually treated us both equally. He actually came to my things. He actually seemed genuinely interested in my life. Gabriel left for London like 6 years ago to work in finance, because obviously he had to go abroad and be successful and make tons of money. And since then, he only comes back like twice a year. But when he comes, it's like the second coming of Christ, according to my father. My father plans everything around Gabriel's visits, cancels plans, makes sure everything is perfect, and Gabriel eats it all up because he's basically an arrogant person who thinks the world revolves around him. Don't get me wrong. I love my brother on some level because he's my brother. But he's also someone who's never had to consider other people's feelings because he's always been the center of attention. My mother died of cancer 6 years ago, right before Gabriel left for London, and that was devastating for everyone. She was only 52 years old, and the cancer was aggressive. Like in 6 months, it went from a diagnosis to being in palliative care. During that time, my father was there. I'll admit that. But even in those horrible moments, you could see how he paid more attention to how Gabriel was dealing with the situation than to how I was. After the funeral, Lawrence stayed with us. He didn't go anywhere, and that meant a lot to me because he basically became my real father figure, the one who listened to me, the one who cared about how I really was. I met Eric 5 years ago at a work conference. One of those boring conferences where everyone's half asleep except he made a sarcastic comment about the presentation and we both laughed, and that's how it all started. Eric is an architect. He's 30 years old, and he's literally the most genuine person I know, like someone who really listens to you and makes you feel like what you say matters. We got engaged like a year and a half ago. It was on a beach trip we took. Nothing super elaborate, but it was perfect for us. And we started planning the wedding almost immediately because we both wanted something simple and meaningful. We decided to have the wedding in the backyard of our house, which we bought together 2 years ago, and has this beautiful backyard with big trees and enough space for about 50 people. We wanted something intimate, just close family and important friends. None of those giant weddings that cost a fortune and where you end up talking to people you barely know. We picked a date that was our 4-year dating anniversary, a Saturday in April, and we started sending out invitations like 4 months in advance. I told my father the date in person. I went to his house and showed him the invitation and everything. And he said that of course he'd be there, that he wouldn't miss it for anything in the world. And I believed him, because, I don't know, I guess a small part of me still had hope that this time would be different. Things started getting weird, like 2 months before the wedding. Gabriel called my father and told him he'd organized this camping trip with his friends from London, that they were going to rent some cabins somewhere in Scotland, and that he'd reserved an extra spot in case my father wanted to go. And here's the incredible part. The trip was exactly the same weekend as my wedding. When I say exactly, I mean it was the same Saturday, the same dates, everything. My father called me like a week after Gabriel told him this, and over the phone, not even in person. He asked me if we could move the wedding a couple of weeks because Gabriel had organized this trip and it was a unique opportunity for them to spend time together, since Gabriel was almost never in the country. I went silent for like 10 seconds because I honestly couldn't process what I was hearing. I told him, "Dad, the invitations are already sent, people already saved the date, we have the catering booked, literally everything is ready." And he told me, "Well, but there's still 2 months. Surely you can let everyone know and move things around. And besides, Gabriel almost never organizes these things, and he really wants me to go." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Like that feeling where you know something horrible is happening but your brain is still trying to understand it. I asked him, "Are you saying you'd rather go on a camping trip with Gabriel than come to my wedding?" And he got defensive, saying it wasn't that he was just asking if it was possible to move the date, that he wasn't seeing it as a competition. But it was a competition, you know? It had always been a competition where Gabriel automatically won without even trying. I told him no, that we weren't going to move the wedding, that the date was important to us and everything was already planned. He went quiet for a moment and then said, "Well then, I'm gonna have to think about it," and hung up. I'm gonna have to think about it. My own wedding, and he had to think about it. Eric was there when this happened and he saw me basically fall apart. Not cry yet, but enter that state where you're so angry and hurt that you don't know what to do with your body. Eric hugged me and told me that if my father didn't come, that said everything about him and nothing about me. But it still hurt. You know what I mean? It hurt in a way I can't even explain properly. Like 3 days passed and my father called me again. He told me he'd talked to Gabriel, and Gabriel had told him the trip was important to him, that he'd already paid for everything and couldn't get a refund, and that he hoped I would understand, but he was going to go camping. That he was going camping instead of to my wedding. He said it like that, trying to sound reasonable, as if it were a logical decision and not a direct stab to the heart. I asked him if Gabriel knew it was my wedding weekend, and my father admitted that yes, Gabriel knew, but according to him it wasn't intentional, that it had simply been the only weekend that worked for all his friends. I yelled at him. I yelled at him over the phone, something I'd never done. I told him it was incredible that after a lifetime of putting me second, this was what he chose to do. That it was my wedding. That supposedly daughters' weddings were important to fathers, and he just kept saying, I'm sorry. But I already promised Gabriel." I hung up the phone and started crying, like crying in those ways where you can't breathe properly and you feel like you're going to choke. Eric didn't know what to do except hug me and let me cry. And after like an hour, he asked me, "Do you want to postpone the wedding?" And that question, I don't know why, made me even angrier. Not at Eric, but at the whole situation. Because why did I have to change my plans? Why did I always have to be the one who adapted, who understood, who was reasonable? But then I thought of something. I thought of Lawrence, of my stepfather who'd been there for me more than my own father. And I got this idea that was horrible and vindictive but also felt perfectly fair. I called my father the next day and told him, in the calmest voice I could manage, that it was okay, that I understood he wanted to go with Gabriel, and if that's what he wanted to do, go ahead. He sounded relieved, like way too relieved, and told me thanks for understanding. I know this isn't easy, but Gabriel really. And I interrupted him and said, "Just so you know, I'm going to ask Lawrence to walk me down the aisle." Absolute silence on the other end. My father said, "What?" And I repeated, "Lawrence is going to walk me down the aisle and give me away to Eric, since you won't be there." My father started saying, "No, that wasn't necessary, that maybe he could talk to Gabriel about the trip." And I told him, "No, Dad, you already decided enjoy your camping," and hung up. I'm not gonna lie, I felt horrible and powerful at the same time. Horrible because part of me wanted my father to be there. I wanted to have that mental image of my dad walking me down the aisle like you see in the movies. But powerful, because for the first time in my life, I was telling him that his decisions had consequences. I called Lawrence that same afternoon. He was still living in the house where we grew up with my mom before she died, and I asked him if I could come see him. When I got there, I told him everything, every detail, and Lawrence looked genuinely sad for me, Not that fake kind of pity, but real sadness. I asked him if he would do me the honor of walking me down the aisle, and his eyes filled with tears, literally, and he said it would be the greatest honor of his life. The weeks before the wedding were weird. My father didn't call me. I didn't call him. And Gabriel sent a WhatsApp message saying he was sorry he's gotten complicated, but he hoped we'd have a beautiful wedding. Not even a voice message, just a generic text. Eric and I continued with the preparations. We finalized everything with the catering, with the photographer, with the person who was going to officiate the ceremony. And I tried not to think too much about my father because every time I did, I'd get sad or angry or both. Lawrence helped me a ton with the last-minute preparations. He came to the house like 3 times to help fix up the yard, put up the lights, make sure everything looked perfect. And every time I saw him, I thought about how unfair it was that this man who didn't share my blood cared more about me than the one who did. The wedding day arrived, and I'm not gonna lie, I woke up crying. Eric found me in the bathroom with my face all swollen and hugged me without saying anything because he already knew why I was crying. There was no need to explain. He helped me calm down, made me tea, told me to take things easy, that we had all the time in the world before the ceremony started. My friends arrived like at 2 in the afternoon to help me get ready. They brought champagne and music and tried to make everything feel festive and happy. And it worked to some extent. I mean, I managed to get into bride mode and get excited about what was happening. The dress fit perfectly. The makeup turned out beautiful. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, I thought, this is real. I'm getting married. And I tried to focus only on that. The ceremony was planned for 5 in the afternoon, and at 4:30, the guests started arriving. About 50 people total, friends from college, co-workers, some cousins of mine, Eric's parents, his siblings, and Lawrence, who arrived in a new suit he'd bought especially for the occasion. The yard looked incredible. We'd put up these string lights between the trees and flowers everywhere, and the weather was perfect. Sunny, but not too hot. Everyone was sitting in the white chairs we'd rented. The music started, and the moment came when Lawrence came into the house to walk me out to the yard. Lawrence saw me, and his eyes filled with tears again. He told me I looked beautiful, that my mom would be so proud, and I also started crying but tried not to ruin my makeup. I gave him my arm and we went out together. And when the wedding march started and everyone turned to look at me, I felt this weird mix of total happiness and deep sadness. Happy because I was marrying Eric, because the people who really mattered to me were there. But sad because my father had chosen not to be there, had actively chosen not to be there for this moment. Lawrence squeezed my arm like saying, "You're doing great," and we walked slowly down the aisle while I tried to smile and not start crying in front of everyone. Eric was at the end of the aisle and looked so happy, so excited. And when we arrived and Lawrence gave me away to him, Lawrence said something quietly that I couldn't quite hear but made Eric nod seriously. The ceremony was short but beautiful. We said our vows that we'd written ourselves, exchanged rings, and when they told us, "You may kiss the bride," Eric kissed me and everyone started clapping and cheering. And for a moment, I forgot all the drama and just felt pure happiness. The reception was in the same yard. We set up tables and music and food, and we danced and laughed and everything was perfect, or as perfect as it could be considering the circumstances. The photographer took like 1,000,000 photos. Of the ceremony, of the reception, of us cutting the cake, of the speeches Eric's friends gave, of Lawrence dancing with me to the father-daughter song we'd chosen. And here's where I made a decision that maybe was vindictive but was also honest. I asked the photographer to send me one of the good photos that same night, one where you could see me with Lawrence walking down the aisle, and I sent it to my father on WhatsApp without any message, just the photo. It was like 10 at night when I sent it. The reception was still in full swing, and I wasn't expecting an immediate response. But my father saw it almost instantly. My phone started ringing like 5 minutes later. It was my father calling. And I didn't answer. He called 4 times in a row. Then the messages started coming. Tons of messages saying he'd made a horrible mistake, that he was coming back from camping right that moment, that please forgive him, that he'd been an idiot, that he wanted to talk to me. Eric saw me looking at my phone and asked if I was okay. And I showed him the messages, and he just said, "It's your decision what to do. I support you in whatever." I turned off my phone and kept enjoying my wedding, danced with my friends, ate cake, toasted with champagne, and tried not to think about my father driving back in the middle of the night. The next day, Sunday, My father showed up at our house like at 9 in the morning. Eric and I were still half asleep, destroyed from the party the night before, and we heard someone knocking on the door insistently. Eric went to open it because I didn't want to, and I heard my father's voice asking for me, saying he needed to talk to me urgently. I put on a robe and went downstairs, and my father was standing there at the entrance, still in his camping clothes. He looked terrible, tired, and desperate, and when he saw me, he started crying. My father, who I'd never seen cry except at my mom's funeral, was there crying and saying he was so sorry, that he'd made the worst mistake of his life, that he loved me, that please give him another chance. I told him to come in because I didn't want to have this conversation at the door, and we sat in the living room. Eric went to the kitchen to give us space, but stayed close in case I needed him. My father told me that after seeing the photo he couldn't sleep, that he told Gabriel and his friends he had to leave, that he drove all night to get there, and that he wanted to know if we could do another ceremony, something small, just so he could walk me down the aisle and feel like he'd been there. I looked at him like he was crazy. Like, are you seriously just suggesting that? And I told him no, that we weren't going to do another ceremony, that the moment had already passed and he had chosen not to be there. My father kept crying and saying he understood why I was angry, but please don't punish him forever, that he wanted to fix things, and that's when something in me broke. I told him, Dad, this isn't just about the wedding. Do you understand? This is about my whole life. This is about every time you went to Gabriel's games, but not to my debate competitions. This is about every time you celebrated his achievements, but ignored mine. This is about every time you made me feel like I wasn't important enough for you to pay attention to me. The wedding was just the straw that broke the camel's back. But the camel's back has been filling up for 28 years. My father was looking at me like he'd never thought about that, like he genuinely hadn't realized. And I tried not to let myself soften because of his confused face. I told him, you chose to go camping with Gabriel, who's 30 years old and lives in another country and who you see twice a year, instead of coming to your daughter's wedding who lives here and has always been available to you. What am I supposed to think about that? What am I supposed to feel? My father said I was right, that he'd been horrible, that Gabriel had always been easier to relate to because they shared interests like sports and whatever. But that wasn't an excuse for having neglected me so much. I asked him if Gabriel knew my wedding was that weekend when he organized the trip, and my father went quiet for a long moment and then admitted that yes, Gabriel knew, but had told him that surely I would understand, that weddings could be moved and camping trips couldn't. That made me so angry, so furious, that Gabriel had known and still organized the trip on that specific date, that he'd told my father I would understand, as if my wedding was something negotiable. I told my father, and didn't it seem weird to you that Gabriel did that? Didn't it seem strange that your son would organize something exactly when his sister is getting married? My father looked miserable, totally miserable, and said yes, that he'd had that feeling, but Gabriel had told him it was a coincidence, and he'd believed him because he wanted to believe him. I told him to leave, that I needed space, that I wasn't ready to forgive him or to pretend everything was okay just because now he felt bad. My father left crying, literally left the house sobbing, and I sat there feeling horrible and relieved at the same time. Eric came and hugged me and told me I'd done the right thing, that it was valid to set boundaries, that my father needed to understand that his actions had consequences. The following days were weird. My father sent me messages every day, sometimes several a day, saying he was sorry, that he wanted to fix things, that please give him a chance to make it up. I didn't respond, just read the messages and left them there, because honestly, I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I wanted to forgive him or if I was ready to have that conversation. A week after the wedding, we were about to leave for our honeymoon. Eric and I had planned 2 weeks in Greece, and I decided to call my father before we left. I told him I was going to be out of the country for 2 weeks, that during that time I wasn't going to answer calls or messages because I wanted to enjoy my honeymoon without drama, and that when I got back, maybe we could talk calmly. My father agreed, said he understood, that he'd respect my space, that he hoped we'd have an amazing time. I felt a bit better after that call. Like at least I'd established a clear boundary and he'd accepted it. Greece was beautiful. Like those vacations you see on Instagram and think they can't be real, but they are. Eric and I visited islands, ate incredible food, swam in crystal clear waters, and I tried not to think about the family drama. I managed to really relax for the first time in months, but then, like on day 10 of the trip, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I don't answer unknown numbers, but something made me answer. And it was Gabriel. Gabriel calling from what was obviously a borrowed phone or one of those burner phones because he knew I wouldn't have answered if I'd seen his name. Gabriel started with his usual condescending tone, that tone of, "I'm older and more successful than you, so I know more," telling me he'd talked to Dad and that he was devastated, or that he'd never seen Dad so bad, and that I was being selfish and cruel by cutting off all communication. Selfish and cruel. Those were his words. I told him, "Gabriel, do you realize your camping trip was on my wedding day? Do you realize you asked Dad to choose between us and he chose you?" And Gabriel had the nerve to say that hadn't been his intention, that he'd simply organized a trip with his friends and had invited Dad as a nice gesture, that I was making drama out of something that wasn't a big deal. I yelled at him. I yelled at him over the phone in the middle of a restaurant in Santorini, and people turned to look at us. I told him he was a selfish, arrogant person who'd never in his life had to consider others because he'd always been the center of Dad's universe, that he knew perfectly well what he was doing when he organized that trip, and that if Dad was devastated, it was his fault for creating that situation. Gabriel said I was being dramatic, that family was important, and I needed to forgive Dad because he was our father and deserved respect. I told him that respect is earned, and Dad hadn't done anything in my life to earn mine at that moment, and I hung up. Eric was there, and I looked worried. He asked me if I was okay, and I told him about the conversation, and he said something that stuck with me. He said, "Your brother is never going to understand because he's never been second place in anything. It's impossible for him to understand your experience because his life has been completely different." And he was right. Gabriel lived in a reality where he was important and valuable and worthy of attention automatically. He couldn't comprehend what it was like to grow up feeling invisible. I tried not to let the call ruin the rest of the trip, but it still left a bitter taste. That feeling that even when I was far away trying to be happy, my family found a way to bring me drama. When we got back from Greece, I saw that my father had kept his word and hadn't contacted me during the 2 weeks. But Gabriel had sent like 5 more messages lecturing me about the importance of family and forgiveness. I ignored them all. A few days passed, getting back into the routine, and one afternoon I decided I needed to talk to my father. Not because I'd completely forgiven him, but because I felt I needed to close that chapter somehow. I called him and asked if I could go to his house to talk, and he said yes immediately, whenever I wanted, that he was always available. I went alone to my father's house, that house that had been his bachelor pad after the divorce and that had always seemed kind of sad and empty to me. My father opened the door and looked different, like suddenly older, more tired, and he offered me coffee, which I accepted even though I didn't really want it. We sat in the living room, the same living room where I'd spent so many obligatory visitation weekends when my parents divorced, and I told him I needed to say some things and he just needed to listen. My father nodded and stayed quiet while I spoke. I told him I understood that loving 2 children differently was normal, that parents are human and have preferences even if they don't admit it, but that the way he'd treated me, my whole life wasn't just having a preference, it was emotional neglect. That every time he'd chosen Gabriel over me, every time he'd ignored my achievements or hadn't shown up to my events, he'd sent me the message that I didn't matter as much, that my value as a daughter was less. I told him the wedding had simply been the final confirmation of something I already knew, that when it came to choosing, he was always going to choose Gabriel. My father started crying again, and I kept talking because I needed to get it all out. I told him I appreciated that he felt bad now, that he recognized his mistake. But that didn't erase years of feeling like a second choice, that it wasn't something that could be fixed with apologies and promises to change, that maybe eventually we could rebuild some kind of relationship, but it was going to be on my terms and at my pace, not when it was convenient for him. My father said he understood, that he accepted whatever I wanted, that he just wanted the opportunity to show me he could be better. I told him we were going to have low contact, that I wasn't going to be going to Sunday lunches or pretending we were a happy family, and that he could send me messages. But I was going to respond when I was ready, and not before. That if Gabriel tried to pressure me or lecture me again, I was going to cut him off too without thinking twice. My father accepted everything, said yes to everything, that he'd do whatever I needed. I asked him if he really understood why I was so angry, not just about the wedding, but about everything. And he said he was starting to understand, that he'd been talking a lot with a therapist in recent weeks, and that he was realizing patterns he'd had his whole life. We sat in silence for a while, And then my father asked me if I could ever forgive him completely, and I told him honestly that I didn't know that forgiveness wasn't something I could promise because I didn't know if it would come naturally or not. That for now the best I could do was keep the door open a crack, but he shouldn't expect it to open completely anytime soon. I left his house feeling exhausted but also lighter, like I'd said everything I needed to say, and now I could start processing everything without keeping it bottled up. It's been like 3 months since the wedding, and life has continued in a strange way. My father sends me messages every 2 weeks or so, short messages asking how I am, or telling me something about his day. And I respond when I want to. Sometimes immediately, and sometimes days later. Gabriel tried to call me one more time after our conversation in Greece, but I didn't answer, and eventually he sent a message saying he respected my decision but hoped we could talk someday. I didn't respond because honestly I have nothing to say to him. He's still the same and probably will never really understand why I'm angry. Lawrence is still amazing. I see him more often than my father. Eric and I have dinner with him like once a month. And it's weird, but also nice to have this father figure who genuinely cares and doesn't bring all the emotional weight of years of neglect. Eric says I'm handling everything well, that he's proud of how I've set boundaries and how I'm protecting my mental peace. And that means a lot to me because sometimes I feel guilty, like maybe I'm being too hard or too resentful. I don't know what's eventually going to happen with my relationship with my father, if we'll be able to rebuild something meaningful or if it's always going to be this distant and cordial thing. Part of me wants to believe that people can change, that my father is really going to do the work to understand his behavior and be different, but another part of me knows that lifetime patterns don't change easily. For now, I'm focused on my own life, on my marriage to Eric, on building the family I want to have, one where everyone feels valued and seen, and that's enough for me. Last week, Eric and I were looking at the wedding photos, the ones the photographer sent us all edited and beautiful, and there was a photo of Lawrence and me dancing during the father-daughter song, and we were both laughing about something, completely happy in that moment. Eric asked me if I regretted asking Lawrence to walk me down the aisle instead of waiting for my father to reconsider, and I told him no, that I didn't regret it one bit, because Lawrence had earned that moment in a way my father never did. And that's the truth. I guess that family isn't always the people you share blood with. Sometimes it's the people who choose to be present,